I've lost count of the nights I've wasted just lying there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, hoping that tomorrow would somehow be different. It's almost embarrassing to admit how many times I've gone to bed telling myself that change is just around the corner. But the next morning, nothing changes. I wake up, hit the alarm, and go through the same motions, brushing my teeth, making coffee, and dragging myself to the job that pays the bills but drains my soul. It's like being stuck in a loop of comfort that disguises itself as routine. Deep down, I know that every night I go to bed hoping for change without doing anything about it. I'm just lying to myself. I know that waiting for change is just another way of choosing to stay the same. But last night was different. I couldn't sleep. My mind was too loud, filled with thoughts I couldn't ignore any longer. I found myself standing at the window, staring at the city lights. It hit me then like a wave. I couldn't stop. My life is stagnant. I'm stuck. A voice inside whispered, "What are you waiting for?" I didn't have an answer. My hands trembled as I pulled out a dusty old notebook from the shelf. It was a relic from a time when I believed I'd become a filmmaker, a dream I had when I was younger and less afraid of failing. I sat down at my desk, flipped through blank pages, and found one where I had scribbled years ago. "Become who you are." I couldn't even remember writing it, but it struck me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't who I wanted to be. I wasn't even close. I had become a spectator in my own life, watching the days go by without daring to make a move. I grabbed a pen and started writing, but not about my dreams or ambitions. No, that felt too fake. Instead, I wrote down every excuse I've made, every fear I've clung to, every lie I've told myself about why I can't change. It was ugly. I wrote that I was lazy, scared, and too comfortable to take risks. I admitted that I'd rather distract myself with meaningless routines than confront the truth. I wrote that I envied those who had the courage to break free from mediocrity, but I didn't want to admit that I lacked their courage. That's when I stopped. I put down the pen and stared at the page, disgusted by the person I described. Was this really me? For a moment, I considered tearing out the page, pretending it never happened. Maybe it was just a bad night. Maybe I was being too hard on myself. But that's just another excuse, isn't it? Another way to avoid the truth. I thought of a quote from Marcus Aurelius. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Was I really so powerless, or was I just too scared to confront myself? I knew the answer. I had been hiding from it for years. I looked at the page again. The words didn't change, but something inside me did. I felt a strange sense of relief, not because I had figured everything out, but because I finally faced what I was so desperate to avoid. That's the thing about change. It doesn't happen because you dream about it. It happens when you look at yourself without filters and accept that you've been the problem all along. It wasn't just fear holding me back. It was the comfort of staying the same. Change meant facing the reality that I'd wasted so much time, and that realization was terrifying. But not as terrifying the thought of staying like this forever. I couldn't help but wonder how many people are stuck in this same loop, hoping for change while refusing to take the first step. Didn't want to be one of them anymore. I thought about Tarantino, how he didn't wait for permission to start writing a story. He just did it. He didn't let the world dictate what he could or couldn't become. So why was I waiting for something to happen when the power to change was always in my hands? I knew what I had to do. I started writing again, this time with a clearer mind. I wrote down 3 things I needed to change, simple, realistic goals. I wouldn't try to overhaul my entire life in one night, but I would start with these steps. First, I would wake up an hour earlier and write every morning, no excuses. If I wanted to reclaim that dream of storytelling, I had to practice it every day. Second, I would apply for that job. I kept avoiding because I was afraid of rejection. Even if I didn't get it, at least I would have tried the third. I would finally end a friendship that had long since turned toxic. I kept holding on out of guilt, but I knew it was dragging me down. When I put the pen down, I didn't feel accomplished. I felt vulnerable, but it was the kind of vulnerability that felt real, like stepping out into the cold after being locked inside for too long. The night was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts. I looked at the city outside the window again, but this time it looked different. It wasn't just a backdrop to my endless loop. It was a world waiting for me to step into it with purpose. For the first time in a long while, I didn't dread tomorrow. I was curious about it, curious to see if I could actually follow through. I knew it wouldn't be easy and fear wasn't going to vanish overnight. But I also knew that if I kept waiting for courage to come to me, I'd be waiting forever. I closed the notebook and left it open on my desk. I wanted to see it first thing in the morning. A reminder that I had finally made a choice. As I lay down to sleep, I didn't feel like a new person. I still had doubts and fears, but I had something else too, a sense of ownership over my own story. That night, I didn't just plan for change, I chose it, and that made all the difference. I woke up the next morning with a sense of unease. My notebook was still open on the desk, and I could see the messy scrawl of my late-night thoughts from across the room. Part of me wanted to pretend it was just a bad dream, that none of those raw, unfiltered admissions ever made it onto paper. But when I sat down and looked at the words again, I couldn't deny them. I had faced something real, something I'd been avoiding for years. It was terrifying to see my flaws laid bare, but it was also strangely liberating. I didn't feel better exactly, but I felt more awake, like I just opened a door I didn't know existed. That morning, I didn't rush through my routine like I usually did. I made my coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl in the mug, and took a moment to just breathe. My mind kept replaying that one thought. What if I'd been living like a spectator in my own story? I couldn't shake it. On my way to work, I felt oddly detached from the familiar sights. The crowded bus, the hum of engines, the buzz of people glued to their phones. I looked at them and wondered how many of us are stuck in the same loop. How many of us wake up every day with a faint hope that something will change, only to fall back into the same patterns by nightfall. I caught my own reflection in the bus window and barely recognized myself. I wasn't just seeing my face, I was seeing a man who had let fear dictate his choices. That realization stung, but I couldn't let it slip away. When I finally reached my office, a sterile gray cubicle where time seemed to stand still, I felt a wave of suffocation, the papers stacked on my desk, the blinking light on the phone, the drone of conversation around me. It was all so predictable, so lifeless. I sat down and opened my email, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was that notebook and the truth I had written down. I was sick of being stuck, sick of being afraid, sick of letting life happen to me instead of living it on my own terms. At lunch, I left the office and wandered around the block. I needed to clear my head, but every step felt heavy. My thoughts were circling around that one idea. If I don't do something different, I'll stay like this forever. I found a bench in a small park surrounded by faded flowers and cracked pavement. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. I took out my phone and searched for quotes from Marcus Aurelius, words I'd once found inspiring but had since forgotten. One caught my eye. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. It hit me hard. I'd spent years thinking about what I should be, but never actually becoming it. I saved the quote to my phone and closed my eyes, letting the realization settle in. Back at the office, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. During a slow moment, I pulled out a sticky note and wrote down 3 words: act without fear. I stuck it to the corner of my computer screen as a reminder to stop waiting for the perfect moment to act. The rest of the day dragged on, but the words stared back at me like a challenge. I knew I couldn't just go home and forget about it. So when my shift finally ended, I didn't follow my usual routine of heading straight back to my apartment. Instead, I took a detour to a bookstore I browsed aimlessly for a while, unsure of what I was looking for. Then tucked between motivational guides and self-help bestsellers, I found a small worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I hesitated, but something pushed me to buy it. That night, I sat on my bed with the book in one hand and my notebook in the other. I flipped through Meditations and landed on a passage. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. It felt like a message crafted just for me. My fears, my doubts, they weren't barriers, they were the path. If I wanted to change, I needed to move through them, not around them. I opened the notebook and started a new page. This time I wasn't writing about what I had failed to do. I wrote down what I could do right now tonight. I didn't make grand plans or sweeping changes. I focused on small, practical steps. Wake up an hour earlier to write 2. Apply for that freelance project I've been putting off. Have an honest conversation with a friend I've been avoiding. They weren't monumental tasks, but they were concrete, they were real. I couldn't help but feel a surge of motivation, like I was finally gaining some control. As I wrote, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet determination that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about transforming overnight or suddenly becoming fearless. It was about choosing to do something, however small, rather than staying paralyzed by doubt. When I finished, I looked at the list and felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I wasn't just writing down dreams, I was making a plan. A plan to step into the fear and take responsibility. I put down the pen and leaned back, the quiet of the night wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I wasn't fixed, I wasn't transformed, but I was moving, and that was enough. I knew the journey wouldn't be easy. I'd probably wake up tomorrow with doubts creeping back in, but tonight I had taken the first real step. I had faced the truth, accepted my flaws, and decided to act. As sleep finally came, I whispered the words to myself, act without fear. And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. It wasn't excitement exactly, more like a cautious hope. The kind that makes you feel like you're standing on the edge of something important, but you're not quite sure what it is. I reached for the notebook on my desk, flipping through the pages I had filled the night before. The words stared back at me, raw and unapologetic. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far, if being that honest with myself was a mistake. But then I remembered what I had felt while writing it, a surge of clarity, like I had finally stripped away the excuses and looked at my life without flinching. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. And I needed that. I sat back, letting my thoughts wander. Change was no longer an abstract idea. It was something I could almost touch. I had been stuck for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to take control, even in small ways. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was a reminder for a meeting at work, another day in the cubicle, another round of pretending I was fine when I wasn't. I couldn't help but wonder if the people around me were feeling the same, going through the motions. While their dreams collected dust, I took a deep breath. Today had to be different. I couldn't just carry on like nothing had changed. On the bus ride to work, I found myself mentally sorting through the different parts of my life like a director breaking down a film script. There were chapters I could easily define. Dreams I gave up on, relationships I neglected, habits that held me back. It was sobering to think that my life could be divided into scenes where I repeatedly chose comfort over courage. But instead of letting that thought drag me down, I felt something else, a quiet determination to rewrite those scenes. I didn't know how to change everything overnight, but I knew I had to start somewhere. I thought about that list I made last night, the 3 concrete actions that could push me in a new direction. They seemed small, almost insignificant, but they were a start. By the time I reached the office, I had made a decision. I was going to do one thing differently today. Just one. I couldn't let the whole day slip by without at least making a small step forward. During my lunch break, I pulled out my phone and opened a new email draft. I had been putting off applying for a freelance writing gig for weeks. I kept telling myself I wasn't good enough, that I'd be rejected anyway, so why bother? But that was the old way of thinking, the version of me that was too scared to even try. I wasn't that person anymore, or at least I didn't want to be. I typed out a quick message, attached a sample of my work, and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. As soon as the email was gone, I felt a wave of anxiety, like I had just jumped into freezing water. But beneath that, there was something else, a sense of relief. I had done it. I had taken a small, terrifying step, and the world hadn't ended. That night, I sat down with my notebook again. This time, I didn't just focus on what I had done wrong. I wrote about that small victory, how sending that email felt like cracking open a door that had been shut for too long. I realized that change didn't have to be monumental to matter. It just had to be intentional. One action at a time, one choice at a time, I could rebuild my story, but only if I took ownership of every chapter. I decided to write out a new scene, one where I wasn't a passive character anymore. I wrote about what I wanted to become: disciplined, fearless, resilient. I knew I wasn't there yet, but putting it into words made it feel possible. As I wrote, I couldn't help but think about my old dreams, the ones I had left behind, because they seemed too far out of reach. Filmmaking used to be more than just a hobby, it was my passion. I remember the late nights I spent editing short videos trying to capture stories that mattered to me. I had let that part of me slip away, convincing myself that adulthood meant giving up on unrealistic dreams. But maybe I had been wrong. Maybe growing up didn't mean letting go of passion. It meant finding a way to weave it into the life I was living. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let fear decide for me anymore. I wrote that down as a promise to myself: I will act without fear. The next day I felt lighter, like I had finally broken the loop, even if just a little. At work, I noticed things I had ignored before: the monotony, the lack of purpose, the way people shuffled through tasks without ever looking up. I didn't want to become that. When I got home, I pulled out the old camera from my closet, the one I hadn't touched in years. I did not know what I would film or whether it would be any good, but it didn't matter. The act of picking it up, of dusting it off, and charging the battery felt like reclaiming a part of myself. That night, I filmed a short clip, just me talking to the camera about the realization I had. I talked about how fear had kept me stagnant, how waiting for the right moment had paralyzed me. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. When I played it back, I didn't cringe like I usually did. I saw a guy who was trying, who was tired of waiting, and finally taking small, deliberate steps. It wasn't the masterpiece I had envisioned years ago, but it was a start. Before going to bed, I watched the clip again and saved it. I didn't post it anywhere or share it with anyone. It was just for me, a reminder that I was capable of taking action, no matter how small. As I lay in bed, I realized that my story wasn't something that would change overnight. It was something I would rewrite every day. By choosing to face fear, by refusing to let comfort win, by daring to take small, meaningful steps. That night, I didn't feel stuck. I felt alive because I was finally moving forward. I knew there would be setbacks and days when doubt crept back in, but for now, I had something that had been missing for a long time: hope. I whispered the words one more time before sleep claimed me. Act without fear. This time I believed it a little more. The morning light seeped through the blinds, and I opened my eyes, feeling more awake than I had in a long time. It wasn't just the sleep, it was something deeper. The kind of wakefulness that comes from deciding to do something about your life instead of just complaining about it. As I sat up, I glanced at my notebook on the desk. It was still open to the page where I had written those 3 simple goals. They looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, more tangible. I couldn't remember the last time I actually felt motivated to follow through on something that scared me. Today, I wasn't going to let fear win. I made my coffee, slowly savoring the quiet of the morning. The words from the night before kept replaying in my mind. Act without fear. I wasn't sure how long this resolve would last, but I wasn't going to waste it. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. No response yet from the freelance gig. But I wasn't going to let that deter me. The old me would have already convinced himself that silence meant rejection, but not today. As I got ready for work, I couldn't help but notice how my mind was racing, a mix of anxiety and determination. I kept thinking about that camera I had dusted off the short clip I had recorded. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For once, I didn't feel ashamed of my own voice or the honesty I had shared. During my commute, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I had been looking at change all wrong. Maybe I had been so focused on the end goal, on being the person I wanted to be, that I forgot the importance of the small steps, the things that don't seem significant on their own, but together add up to something bigger. As I sat on the bus, I noticed the tired faces around me. The same people I saw every morning, shuffling through their routines. I used to feel like one of them, resigned, drained, caught in the loop. But today I felt different. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a subtle shift. Like I was finally moving in a direction I chose. I couldn't help but wonder how many of these people had dreams they had given up on. Maybe they didn't even remember why they stopped trying. Maybe like me, they convinced themselves that it was too late to start over. But was it? At work, I sat down at my desk, the sticky note still stuck to the corner of my monitor. Act without fear. It was a small reminder, but every time I looked at it, it reminded me that I didn't have to be perfect to move forward. I just had to keep going. Mid-morning, I checked my phone out of habit. An email notification flashed on the screen. It was from the freelance gig, the one I had been too afraid to apply for until yesterday. My heart pounded as I opened it. The message was brief, but it wasn't a rejection. They wanted to see more of my work. I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. A part of me wanted to celebrate, but another part was terrified. What if I wasn't good enough? What if they asked for something I couldn't deliver? I took a deep breath. This was the fear talking, the fear I had promised myself I wouldn't let win. I couldn't keep sabotaging my own progress just because the future was uncertain. I replied with a thank you message, attached a few more samples, and hit send before I could overthink it. Then I sat back trying to process what just happened. I had taken a chance and it hadn't blown up in my face. That was new. At lunch, I found myself wandering back to that little park. I sat on the same bench trying to let the reality of my small victory sink in. It wasn't a job offer, but it was a step closer than I had been yesterday. I pulled out my phone and opened Meditations again, scrolling to the quote I had saved. The impediment to action advances. Action, what stands in the way, becomes the way. For so long I had seen my fear as a barrier, something that kept me stuck. But what if fear was actually the sign that I was moving in the right direction? What if discomfort was just a part of growth, not something to avoid? The thought gave me a kind of peace I wasn't used to. Back at the office, I couldn't help but notice how my coworkers moved through the day, robotic, distracted, resigned. I used to think that was just life, that growing up meant losing that spark, that sense of purpose. But now I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just easier to go through the motions than to face the uncomfortable truth that we could be doing more. Maybe the fear of failing made routine feel safe. After work, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I went back to the bookstore and bought a small journal. I wanted something portable, something I could carry with me when I needed to remind myself to act without fear. I wrote one sentence on the first page: do something uncomfortable every day. It seemed simple enough, but I knew it wasn't. Doing what's uncomfortable meant challenging myself to act instead of just planning to speak, instead of staying quiet to take a step, even if it wasn't perfect. That evening, I sat at my desk with the camera again. I recorded another clip this time about the email I sent and how it felt to get a response. I talked about the fear of not being good enough and how I almost didn't send that reply. After recording, I watched it back and noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, not the naive kind that believes everything will work out without effort, but the cautious, resilient hope that comes from taking action despite fear. I saved the clip, feeling a sense of purpose building inside me. Maybe my story wouldn't change overnight. Maybe I would mess up along the way, but at least I was writing it now, one small step at a time. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the road ahead. I didn't have it all figured out, but that was okay. For the first time in years, I wasn't just hoping for change, I was choosing it. I whispered the words to myself again, like a mantra: act without fear. This time they didn't feel forced, they felt true. I closed my eyes knowing that tomorrow I would take another small step, no matter how uncertain it felt, because change doesn't come in a sweeping, dramatic moment. It happens in the quiet, persistent choices that push you forward, even when you're scared. And I was finally ready to keep moving. When I woke up the next morning, something was different. It wasn't just that I felt more rested, although that was true, it was deeper, like a quiet steadiness had settled in my chest. The notebook was still open on my desk and my camera was right where I left it. I stretched, yawned, and let the realization sink in. I hadn't just made plans last night. I had actually followed through. It wasn't perfection, I hadn't conquered fear or rewritten my life in one grand moment. But I had done something, I had moved forward, and that felt good. As I went through my morning routine, I couldn't help but notice how much lighter I felt. The usual dread of heading to work wasn't there. Instead, there was a faint spark of curiosity, wondering how the day might unfold now that I had started choosing change. On the bus, I found myself looking around at the same faces I'd seen for years. They didn't look any different, but I did. Or at least I felt different, less resigned, more aware. It was like a part of me had woken up after being numb for too long. I glanced down at my phone and noticed a new email notification. It was from the freelance gig. My heart pounded as I opened it, half expecting a polite rejection, but instead it was an invitation to discuss my ideas further. They liked my writing. I couldn't help but smile, a small, shaky smile, but a real one. When I got to work, I couldn't focus on my usual tasks. My mind kept drifting back to that email and the possibilities it opened up. Part of me wanted to tell someone to share that tiny victory, but I held back. This was mine. Something I had done for myself without seeking validation. At lunch, I wandered back to the same park, sitting on that worn-out bench. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. I took out my journal and wrote down the words, "Small wins matter." It wasn't profound or groundbreaking, but it was true. I had spent so long chasing the idea of a massive transformation that I overlooked the power of small, steady steps. As I wrote, I thought about something Marcus Aurelius once said: "Do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life." I hadn't been living that way. I had treated each day as if it didn't matter, as if I had endless time to make changes, so there was no urgency to start now. But that mindset had kept me trapped. I thought about my video clip from the night before, the one where I had talked openly about my fear and how I had almost let it paralyze me again. Maybe I should share it, even if it wasn't perfect. Maybe someone else needed to hear that message. That fear doesn't vanish, but you can move through it. Back at the office, I kept replaying that idea in my head. What if someone saw my video and felt that same spark of change? What if it made a difference, even just a little? Before I could overthink it, I uploaded the clip to my personal page, tagging it with the words, "Act without fear." I hit post, closed my phone, and tried to concentrate on work. My pulse raced. 100 doubts crept in. What if people thought it was ridiculous? What if I sounded too vulnerable, too unpolished? But I didn't delete it. I let it stay, reminding myself that not everything had to be flawless to have value. Throughout the afternoon, notifications popped up, likes, comments, shares. People were responding, some with encouragement, some sharing their own struggles with feeling stuck. One comment stood out: "Thanks for being real. Needed this today." That one sentence made all the fear worth it. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just speaking to the void. I was connecting, sharing something honest without pretending I had all the answers. It felt good. That evening, as I headed home, I passed by the bookstore again. On impulse, I went inside, wandering through the aisles until a familiar cover caught my eye. It was a book on storytelling, a guide to crafting narratives that resonate. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. One passage stood out. Every story is about change, the journey from who you were to who you become. It hit me how much my own story had been stuck in the same chapter for years. But now it was changing, slowly and perfectly. But undeniably, I bought the book and tucked it into my bag, feeling more committed than ever to keep pushing forward. Change didn't have to be dramatic or fast. It just had to be consistent. When I got home, I checked my phone again. More comments had rolled in and a few messages from old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. One of them was from Ryan, a friend I had drifted away from because I didn't feel worthy of his ambition. He had always been the one chasing big dreams while I played it safe. His message was simple: "Man, that video hit home. Let's catch up sometime." I stared at the screen, trying to remember the last time we had a real conversation. Maybe I had pushed him away because his drive reminded me of everything I wasn't. But now I didn't feel that same bitterness. Maybe I was finally ready to reconnect without the old resentment clouding my judgment. That night, I recorded another clip. This time, I talked about small victories, how even tiny steps forward can break the cycle of stagnation. I didn't plan out every word or script it to sound polished. I just spoke from the heart, letting the words come naturally. When I finished, I didn't immediately post it. I just sat there letting the weight of the day sink in. Change was still uncomfortable, but it was also invigorating. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was actively shaping my own story. Before going to bed, I wrote one more line in my notebook. Change isn't about finding the courage once it's about choosing it every day. As I lay down, I didn't feel like a different person. I still had doubts and insecurities, but I was no longer paralyzed by them. I had made progress, and that was enough for now. The night was quiet, and sleep came more easily than it had in years. I knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I wasn't scared of them. I whispered the words to myself one more time. Act without fear, and this time I knew I would. When I woke up the next morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A quiet sense of pride. It wasn't that I had accomplished something huge or groundbreaking. It was simpler than that. I was proud of myself for not backing down, for taking that small but meaningful step toward change. As I got ready for the day, I glanced at my notebook on the desk. The words "act without fear" seemed to glow a little brighter. I couldn't help but smile. I knew I wasn't completely fearless, far from it, but I was learning to act despite the fear, and that made all the difference. I made coffee, took a slow sip, and let the quiet morning settle around me. The video I had posted yesterday was still getting responses. People I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out, sharing their own stories of feeling stuck and scared. It struck me how much we hide from each other, how we pretend we're fine, even when we're not. But vulnerability, I was starting to realize, wasn't a weakness. It was a bridge. When I opened my laptop, there was a new message waiting for me. It was from Ryan, the friend I used to avoid because I didn't feel good enough around him. He wanted to meet up to talk in person. I hesitated. My old instincts flaring up. Would he see right through me? Would he notice how I had been stuck for so long? But then I reminded myself, act without fear. I replied with a simple, let's do it, and set a time to meet at a cafe that evening. Throughout the workday, my mind kept wandering to that message. It wasn't just about meeting an old friend. It was about confronting a version of myself that I didn't want to be anymore. The guy who avoided people out of insecurity. When the day finally ended, I took the bus to the cafe. I got there early. Nervous but determined, I kept running through possible conversations in my head, how to explain why I had pulled away without sounding pitiful. Then I saw Ryan walk in looking pretty much the same, confident, purposeful, like he always knew where he was going. I took a deep breath and waved him over. He greeted me with a warm smile, no trace of judgment in his eyes. That eased some of the tension in my chest. As we sat down, he looked at me and said, "Man, that video, it hit me hard. I didn't know you were going through that." I shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Yeah, just been feeling stuck for a while." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "You know, I've been there too." We all have, but not everyone's brave enough to say it out loud. That caught me off guard. Ryan was the guy who seemed to have it all figured out. The successful career, the steady confidence. I didn't expect him to admit to feeling stuck. Two, he leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes I get so caught up in pushing forward that I forget why I'm doing it. Your video made me realize I've been avoiding some things too." I couldn't help but laugh softly. "Guess we're all just pretending we're fine." "Huh?" He smiled. "Pretty much. But man, seeing you take that step, it made me rethink a lot. I've been meaning to reach out for a while, but I didn't know how." That hit me harder than I expected. All this time, I thought I was the one avoiding him because I wasn't good enough. But maybe he was struggling too, just in a different way. We talked for a long time about our old dreams, the jobs that wore us down, the fear of being stuck forever. It was strange how freeing it felt to admit I didn't have it all together. For once, I wasn't pretending. By the time we left the cafe, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Reconnecting wasn't as scary as I'd made it out to be. In fact, it felt good. Walking home, I realized something important. Changing my story didn't just mean facing myself. It also meant letting others see me without the mask I had worn for so long. That night, I filmed another clip. This time, I talked about how fear isn't just about the big things like changing bum or chasing dreams. Sometimes it's about the small things too, like being honest with a friend or admitting that you're not okay. I didn't script it or plan it out. I just spoke from the heart, sharing how meeting Ryan had made me realize that vulnerability could actually strengthen connections. I wasn't sure if anyone would relate, but it didn't matter. I was finally being honest, not just with myself, but with others too. After posting it, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't hiding. I was just sharing my journey, one imperfect step at a time. The next morning, I woke up to even more responses, people opening up about their own struggles with fear and change. One message stood out. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear this. Thank you." I didn't know how to respond. It felt surreal that something so simple, just talking openly, could make a difference. I saved the message and took a moment to appreciate how far I'd come. As I got ready for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look any different, but I felt different. Less like a spectator, more like the person writing his own story. That evening, I went back to the park carrying my journal. I sat on the bench, letting the familiar noise of the city fade into the background. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Act. Without fear, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's messy. Keep moving forward." It wasn't a perfect mantra, but it was mine. I closed the journal and just sat there, taking in the moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally chosen to confront the parts of myself I'd been running from. As the sun dipped below the skyline, I knew I still had a long way to go. I would have days where doubt crept back in, where fear whispered that I couldn't change. But now I had something stronger to fight back with, a commitment to keep pushing through one small step at a time. That night as I lay in bed, I whispered the words again, "Act without fear." And for once, it didn't feel like a lie, and it felt like the truth I had been waiting to embrace.